Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today our guests are Franky Matisek. He is a PhD, he's Lieutenant Colonel, US Air Force, and a military professor at the US Naval War College. And the second guest is William Reno, who is a professor and chair of the department at the Northwestern University. Both are experts in military training, military education. They both conducted a research on foreign military assistance for Ukraine, and this research was done for the military department of the United States. But the views which they will express in this program are solely theirs, expert opinions, and do not represent the official position of the United States or its authorities. Welcome, Jahara. Welcome, William, and thank you for participating in that program.
Happy to have a chat.
Well, thank you.
So the first question, which actually worries everyone since months, regarding what is happening in the Western assistance towards Ukraine, how much of training is being provided, and is the Western training needed, and to what extent? What is your experience?
Well, our experience is that, to put it in a nutshell, the training that we've seen, it's very much on a U.S. format, which is not surprising, and there's a tendency to train Ukrainians, I think, very proficiently on individual weapons platforms, but the concept of training was an optimistic approach to combined arms maneuver, which I think made sense at the end of 2022, especially after the fall counteroffensive. The problem is that if the situation in Ukraine during 2023 is changing, what we saw was a tendency for the larger bureaucracy of U.S. military and the Defense Department and the political decision makers, that response was pretty slow. Maybe there was a lot of wishful thinking, and Ukrainians, at least the people that we've interacted with, they've benefited from the training, but they take parts of that training and have to apply it, of course, to the reality that they face in Ukraine. So that's the problem that we've seen. There's a mismatch between the concept of the training and, well, what we see on the ground today, and we can also see that the political establishment in the United States is trying to catch up with that, and so they are responding to it. But that is a long-term problem.
To answer your question about the numbers of people trained, it's difficult to get exact, precise numbers, but we can say basically between 2015 and the invasion, there was about 60,000 Ukrainians trained by the U.S. and other Western allies and partners. And then since the invasion, there's been about 90,000 Ukrainians trained since February of 2022.
We have seen at least, or please correct me if I'm wrong, at least two types of the training. The first one is when the Ukrainian soldiers were introduced to the new weaponry systems, which they were not familiar with, like the new tanks or IFVs or other equipment. And another one is teaching the tactics and training what you name combined arms approach, how the unit need to act on the battlefield. And regarding the first part, of course, you can teach a person operating a Javelin anti-tank guided missile or even a Leopard 2 or Abrams tank within several weeks. But is it really possible to teach, if it is our goal, to teach the unit how to act on the battlefield during a couple of weeks?
I would actually say yes, it's entirely possible. The problem, of course, comes back to who is writing and designing that program of instruction. You have to always remember that at the end of the day, as good idea you have for a program to train other military is, it usually comes down to a bunch of mid-level sergeants and younger captains and majors who, again, looking at time requirements and path of least resistance, will usually end up just relying on programs of instruction, also known as POIs, that they have already in like their training folders. So it almost becomes incumbent upon these people at the lower levels to be like, should we train them the way we train ourselves for large-scale combat operations, or should we train the Ukrainians for the battlefield and battle space they face? And more often than not, unfortunately, most U.S. and NATO trainers and advisors default on the path of least resistance, which is we're going to train them on what we know, and hopefully they figure it out and it works out for them. And unfortunately, this is not exactly a good practice, but this also reflects the inertia of most bureaucracies, which is who's taking accountability and responsibility for this. And again, these are people, so most people are going to take the path of least resistance and just give the Ukrainians what they already know. And I think the best example of this was I recently talked to a Ukrainian that had just gotten some training done in Germany, and he literally told me, he's like, they were still teaching us to do patrols as if we were going on patrol in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it really dumbfounded us, because we're like, yeah, that you cannot act like you're fighting the war in Iraq or Afghanistan when facing the Russians in Ukraine. And again, this is just another example of, as awesome as the American way of war is, it unfortunately does not account for localized contexts that our allies and partners face.
Yeah, I mean, the trainer has to deal with however it is that person's being evaluated. So they're in a bind because they're talking to Ukrainian soldiers who come to the training with their own experience and their own reality. And the question then is, how much does the trainer want to depart from the program, the official program? You have to do this by this time, and so forth. So I think Franky and I have found that most trainers are pretty curious about the experiences that Ukrainians have on the battlefield, because they want to learn about the reality of that particular war. I mean, we had the experience earlier this year at a British training site, several British training sites. So at Lyd, for example, basic training, that the British trainers had a program, but we also found that they were very interested in listening to the Ukrainians to try to figure out how could they improve the program. And I think what we saw was learning on both sides. I mean, the problem is that, maybe the British military doesn't have the resources that the U.S. military has, and it's a lot smaller, which is a problem in terms of the intensity of support that the British can give. But that smallness, I think, and particularly the scarcity of resources might have pushed the British to be more open to learning. The trainers get trained by the soldiers to some extent.
And that actually speaks to a different problem that faces the average military in Europe versus the U.S., which is it became abundantly clear to us that the Brits and many other NATO countries, their leadership purposely and consciously made the decision to sacrifice their own military readiness and preparedness to train and equip the Ukrainians. Unfortunately, from a U.S. perspective, there has been no top cover or leadership decisions that we know of that have basically told units, you will train the Ukrainians at the expense of your own military readiness and preparedness. And that reflects a major sort of approach to, at least at the tactical level of, again, when it comes like to Will's point about, deciding what to do. Yes, you're curious, but then you have time constraints. And again, if you don't have top cover saying, hey, if it takes an extra week and it undermines your own military readiness, go ahead and do it. There has been no top cover for that. So a lot of the forces from the U.S. side that do the training there, like except for the National Guard unit, which is purposely assigned to train the Ukrainians in Grafenwohr in Germany, the regionally aligned forces, as they're known, which are permanently positioned U.S. forces in Europe, they are asked, can you train the Ukrainians? And these units reply back, yes, we can, but these are these are the few days a month or this year where we can do it without it hurting our own military readiness and training. And that is a major disjuncture between the U.S. and most of the NATO countries there.
Because they're going to get evaluated. They're going to get evaluated on their own readiness. So at that point of decision, the officer has to decide, now, am I going to help the Ukrainians with this training when I know that it will have a negative impact on the assessment of my own readiness? So that's where I think the top cover is needed, that there needs to be somebody in a superior position that says, yeah, that's okay, your readiness is going to suffer. I mean, for the British, it's different because they can devote a lot of resources to training, and they have historically, and in all sorts of different places in the world. But they don't have to worry about readiness so much, because if there is a major crisis, as one person said to us, well, you guys, meaning the Americans, you're ready. So that gives them license to be able to specialize. So, the Americans, they worry about readiness for good reason, but at a political level, I mean, at some point outside of the military, the political leadership has to sort out, what are the priorities here? Is there a shorter term immediate priority where it's take away from this in order to benefit training and other support for Ukrainians?
And that actually speaks to the broader attitude that we hear as talking points from U.S. leaders, which is, hey, this isn't really hurting America or even the Department of Defense. Look, we've only spent 5% of DoD resources on the Ukrainians, and look, it's destroyed 50% of Russian land forces. And so when you hear them saying things like that, that tells you in their minds they're okay going, we've maybe sacrificed 5% of American military readiness to destroy half of Russia's army. And I think that's an interesting sort of way of looking at the problem that most European militaries are not looking at that way. They're just saying, can we give everything we've got to destroy as much of Russia's military and protect the Ukrainians as much as possible?
So, just let me to ask you to be sure that I've understood you clear. So, when you say that for the Americans, like even for the American army, even the spending of very little amount of their resources, including time resources, could be pretty much hurtful, and that what could stop them from doing that. And while in Europe there is no such discussion, and the discussion goes only like, should this weapon or this training be provided to the Ukrainians because of the consequences or not, but not because of how much it will impact our own military readiness?
Well, I mean, Estonia has a different calculus of interest, I think, than the United States does, which is that for Estonia, as a NATO member, there's certain big things in terms of military readiness that they don't have to be as concerned with because they're part of the larger partnership. So they can devote a lot to assisting Ukrainians. I think that, for the United States, part of the problem is that having global commitments, I mean, that's one thing. And then the other thing is that when you break out of that purely defense world into that political world, it's a question not only of, is this going to impact our readiness by, I don't know, X percent or whatever, but it's that political negotiation in terms of U.S. domestic politics. And then also in the White House, I think that they're much more concerned about issues of escalation because they have to worry about their relationship with Russia and sending signals maybe to China and so forth. So there are all kinds of good reasons, and I think a lot of alignment of interest in assisting Ukraine. But in the White House, the interests are not identical. with Ukraine, and they have to worry about a lot of other things. I mean, on a personal level, sometimes I find it quite frustrating, but if I try to put myself in their heads, I think that they have a difficult task, a lot more worry about managing escalation and so forth than, say, Estonia. It's there's a division of labor in this process.
Oh, that is an interesting point of view, because, like, in Ukraine, when you talk to people, they say that exactly this concept of escalation management led the war where it is now, letting Russians to create the defense lines and to mobilize additional people to train them and to practically prolong the war in the next year, while in summer 22 the Russians were not ready to hold the lines, and with some additional weapons and troops, the Russian lines could be broken in multiple directions, including the directions towards Mariupol. But this is what is in the past and is more about the political level. And we are talking about the practical aspects of military training for the Ukrainian army provided by NATO and by the US. We're talking to Franky Matisek, who is Lieutenant Colonel of the US Air Force and military professor at the US Naval War College, and with William Reno, who is a professor and chair of the department at the Northwestern University. So when we are talking about the military training for the Ukrainian soldiers provided by the Western allies, you have already mentioned the problem when the Ukrainians come to the Western coach with their questions which they have from the battlefield against the Russian army. And the answers they get are mostly focused on the experience which the Western armies have gathered in Afghanistan or in Iraq. Does this problem exist until now, or was it not anymore so severe?
Since 2011, the U.S. has been trying to do this thing called the pivot to Asia since 2011, and that has meant trying to move the entire Department of Defense towards fighting what they think might be a major war in the Indo-Pacific region. Well, many of the services during that time basically, had to say, we need to start forgetting counterinsurgency and counterterrorism and be prepared for a near-peer fight with a country in the Indo-Pacific region. So all of the branches of the U.S. military basically started building this inertia towards this idea known as large-scale combat operations. Now, the idea of large-scale combat operations, also known as LSCO in military parlance, is about fighting a near peer with sort of mutual weapon systems, and to basically break it down, it'd be almost like if we went back to the 1700s and we decided, hey, we're the redcoats, we're going to fight this way, and the other army is going to fight the way we're going to fight. We're going to line up and do all these.
They're going to fight the way we want. We want them to fight.
Yes. And so, over the last decade, the U.S. military has really moved in this direction of how they want to fight the next war. And the problem comes with this juncture, which is we have an assumption of the model of how to fight LSCO a certain way, and we looked at the Ukrainians and we're like, okay, we're going to teach you how to do a little bit of this LSCO, but we do it without understanding that, again, our conception of LSCO is built more around something happening in Asia, or actually us fighting the Russians, and we're trying to get the Ukrainians to fight like us, but without the space, cyber, C2, and air power that comes with the way the Americans fight war. And
which is a big part of LSCO.
And that becomes a really big mismatch. It's kind of like, I guess you could say, I don't know if this translates well to Europeans, but it'd be like training a person to drive a Ferrari, and then you're like, all right, you're going to go to the racetrack, but you don't actually get a Ferrari, you get like an old Yugo. And so you're like, why aren't you driving that thing like a Ferrari? And it's like, I'm trying my best. And it's like, that's the unfortunate thing is, like the model and the routing just doesn't match. And again, it comes down to program of instruction. And again, unless you tell a certain, division or unit, you will become masters of the way to fight in Ukraine. If no one takes accountability for that, it's never going to happen.
And now, like when you mentioned already the question of air power and Air Force, and you, Jahara, is a lieutenant colonel of the U.S. Air Force, and the Ukrainians were waiting for all the time for delivery of the Western jets. F-16 has been like on the name which has been dropped like every time, but not only F-16. We're talking about the Griffin from Sweden and maybe Tornadoes from Germany, you name them. How efficient and how much progress have we achieved in training of the Ukrainian pilots?
It seems like we've been able to compress the training schedules in the sense of you won't need to do instrument approaches. You won't be doing this type of air-to-air combat. So if you tailor and pare down the training to be like, you're mainly going to be used for close air support and interdiction strikes near the front, then you can tailor the training that way. And because there isn't much variation between what the Ukrainians are doing and what the Americans would do if they had to fight in a contested environment like that. And so it's going as well as, from what I hear, it's going as well as it can with compressed timelines, with experienced Ukrainian pilots going through this Western training. The only thing that I would say is unfortunate is don't have your hopes too high on the impact this is going to have, because it's not like we're giving them the top of the line F-16s. They're basically getting F-16s with downgraded avionics and software and hardware that basically makes them like maybe early 2000 model variants of F-16s. And so the way I look at the F-16s that will be, probably reaching the battlefield in early spring of next year is, think of these as basically more MiG-29s. They're just going to be used as bomb trucks, and will at least allow the Ukrainians to pose a threat from the air by maybe generating a few extra air sorties a day.
But it basically contributes to a defensive battle, is what it seems. And in my own experiences visiting Ukraine and being in those areas, I mean, this is what I think the trainers and the American planners are learning, what a defensive battle looks like. The degree to which that battlefield has to be dispersed. I mean, when they're combined arms, maybe the most efficient combined arms is actually at a platoon level, and it's with drones and small mortar teams, or that sort of combination of infantry and artillery. And I think that this is the conundrum that trainers face, and I think that they can learn, but at the level of political leadership, it's a big problem. How do you break the defensive deadlock at the same time that you give support, for the Ukrainian side to dig in? It's a lot harder for the Russians to take territory than it is to defend territory that they already hold, and the same holds true for Ukrainian forces. So it doesn't seem that the F-16s are necessarily going to break that deadlock.
But does it mean that effectively we talk the Ukrainian pilots, look, guys, like, we will teach you like some basics, like how to attack the ground targets and how to support the ground troops, but we don't teach you like how to how to attack the enemy planes, or maybe from the distance, like no real like air fight. Like, please correct me if I'm wrong, as I'm not an expert in innovation.
Well, I
So
mean,
yeah,
when
I mean, they are teaching like the basic fundamentals, but this goes back to the U.S. problem here is like when like I said, we're not giving the Ukrainians the most advanced F-16s that exist right now. We're likely not giving them the most advanced air-to-air missiles. So in many ways, again, like what I was saying, they're basically just getting more MiG-29s. And so unless the Ukrainians get the advanced the weapons on these F-16s, again, you're basically just getting nicer F-16s.
So what it does is, I think, in defensive terms, it just increases the depth of that zone of conflict, so that Russian forces will have a little bit more difficulty concentrating. They'll have more difficulty reaching concentrations of Ukrainian forces, maybe. So what they'll do is they'll have to pull back. They'll have to disperse further in order to support their forces at that front line. And, you know, I mean, what are the Russians going to do? Maybe they'll have to, increase their support for air power. But it doesn't seem that the F-16s, at least the way that people are being trained to use them and the way that they're going to be provided, are going to fundamentally alter the situation.
And what is the experience of the American trainers with the U.S. pilots, if you can share that?
I mean, it's your typical, I mean, the problem is it basically ranges with the trainers. From American perspective, you may have instructor pilots as young as captains, but most are probably going to be majors, lieutenant colonels that probably have about 2,000 to 3,000 hours of flight time, likely have extensive combat experience in Afghanistan and Iraq, and again, that also speaks to a different reality. Is flying around in Iraq and Afghanistan, you had complete and utter air dominance, air supremacy, and there are ways we did airstrikes in both countries that just assumed there would not be any effective counter-air defenses. So, you fought and trained a certain way. Now, of course, all fighter pilots do actually train, inside the U.S. for a war with, a country that has, enemy air defenses, enemy aircraft, things of that nature. So it's not like we're teaching them to do airstrikes like that. However, again, this is the problem: is the Ukrainians are not getting the best F-16s that exist. So, they're only going to be as effective as the hardware and software and weapons we allow them to put on those aircraft. And
Ukrainian pilots have experience in combat against a peer adversary, which is something that these American pilots who are training Ukrainians are not going to have.
So what can be done, not only regarding the pilots training, but also regarding trainings of the ground troops? What can be done to improve this training? Like, should we train more soldiers? Should we focus on training of experienced soldiers already, like just to polish their skills, or should we focus on training of the soldiers who have no experience?
I mean, it's yes, and yes,
yes.
More and more and more. No, it is. You need to do it from vertically and horizontally. The Europeans and the Canadians have been running a lot of the basic combat training centers that basically, is a 5-week course that produces about 200 new Ukrainian infantry, but there's obviously leadership courses. There's obviously lots of bilateral soft training going on with the Ukrainians, and then you have the collective arms, and the combined arms training that the U.S. National Guard and again the Brits and other various other countries are doing, system specific training, but, and I think this goes back to the theme of what Will, Reno, and I are talking about, in the cases where we're actually telling them how to actually employ this effectively in their battle space against the Russians, that to us, if you had to focus one thing, it would actually be on giving them the tools, especially the education to be able to plan and assess on how to use force in a complicated environment that, again, U.S. and NATO forces have never faced, but how can they adapt? And, like to Will Reno's point about, it used to be all about massing forces and concentrating it at a certain point for, a decisive point in a battle. And now it's about defense in depth and dispersion of forces and, pinpricking the enemy with, hundreds of drones every day.
Yeah, that is a very important perspective. What is the goal of the training? And you've already mentioned, do we want to train the Ukrainians to run the offensive operation as if they had the same army like we have and fight against the enemy we usually fight? Or do they need to fight the real enemy they fight with the means which they have? Can we adjust our trainings, or how much of the adjustment of the trainings has been done to focus exactly on the enemy which the Ukrainians face, the Russians?
I think the adjustment's coming. There's considerable interest, I think, within the military establishment and also at the political leadership level. One of the indications of this is, I don't necessarily believe everything I read in the media, but Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal have done a lot of reporting about sort of questions that are being raised within the Biden administration, and I think interest in the Department of Defense about why hasn't the previous approach worked as well as predicted. And they have to do this because it's a question of assistance to Ukraine and its forces in of itself, but it's also a domestic political question in the United States. Because what they have to do is they have to justify what they've done, the expenditures in 2023, and they have to come up with a plan that's convincing to Congress and to the American public. So I think they see that challenge. So they're very motivated to learn and to adjust. And that will be, tactical learning, which I think the military is very interested in. Oops, it turned out not to be the war that we expected it to be. But it's also that political adjustment of how will the support be realigned.
Can we experience some significant strengthening of these programs with much more Ukrainian troops being trained by the Western allies? Or what is being done now is actually sufficient? We just need to polish it and to fit to the needs, but the level is just what we need.
The problem is there is just such a high degree of proliferation of drones on the modern battlefield that no U.S. Army unit or branch has fully looked at their doctrine and basically said, oh, we can't fight like this anymore. I was actually giving a presentation about 2 weeks ago in D.C., and I said something to the effect of, the battlefield is evolving so much within the last year and a half. It seemed like a year ago, American-made Javelins were just destroying all kinds of Russian armor. And now it seems like, over the last few months, you don't see any more videos of Javelins and anti-tank guided missiles being used on the battlefield anymore. And it's because the enemy has adapted to this tactic, and there's other ways of preventing yourself from getting hit by Javelin missiles. And I joked to the audience, a Javelin anti-tank missile costs about $200,000 and blows up one Russian tank and maybe kills a few Russians inside of it. However, for that same $200,000, I could buy 200 drones with really good sensors on them and kill and destroy dozens more Russian vehicles and dozens more Russian troops. And as everyone in Western capitals are becoming more budget conscious, this is going to have to be something that has to be seriously considered. And when I gave that part of my presentation, there happened to be a Ukrainian colonel in the audience who walked up and said, "Thank you for saying that. People want to keep giving us these things that worked a year ago, and we have to tell them, no, it doesn't work anymore. The only thing that's working right now is we need as many drones as we can get that have good sensors and are unjammable." That right now, that's basically what warfare is looking like there now.
Well, and that also involves a different relationship with the private sector. I mean, the innovation and production is something that's, I think, at this point beyond the grasp, or at least the direct control of Department of Defense. And, it's the procurement process, the policy decision-making process is not exactly lightning quick. I mean, that issue with Ukraine, with assistance to Ukraine, it intersects with other things that the Department of Defense has been concerned with, which is its overall relationship with private sector, with dual-use technologies, AI, for example. And, so I think that they're in the process of learning not just about sort of tactical aspects of the battlefield, but also sort of these larger organizational questions. I think another issue is that, a country without a significant navy that can, basically cripple the Russian Navy in the Black Sea. Should the United States build expensive ships? Is that really the right way to go? To give an satisfying answer, you had asked about predictions for the future, which we should be very wary of doing because it rarely turns out that way. But I would say that the model of it is that everybody, when you have mutual stalemate of defense in depth, it's like World War I. You're thinking, okay, well, what technology is going to break this deadlock? World War I, well, maybe we can fly over it. Maybe we can drive over it. And in this case, we don't know what it's going to be. Is it going to be swarms of cheap drones that exhaust an enemy that then buckles? But then what do you do about the defensive positions and these sorts of things? Maybe there's a strategy of escalation, but in some asymmetric way, so that you're not fighting actually on that particular battlefield, but you're fighting in a different domain or in a different territorial space. So I think that these are the sorts of questions that I'm sure people in Ukraine are asking themselves, but also that the people that design and operate these training programs. And it's a pretty intense puzzle, and just the speed of innovation that we've seen. So I think in the very short term, it's a holding pattern that shore up defenses, because we do know that it's more difficult for the adversary to take territory than it is to defend territory they already have. But that's also true on the Ukrainian side. Help to defend territory that they already have, while working on these other puzzles.
Indeed, and that is exactly where we can learn from the Ukrainians, maybe even more than they can learn from us, as they deliver the very practical experience of
there are a lot of things. There are a lot of things that we're learning from Ukrainians. For example, air defense, anti-missile defense, these sorts of things that, with the resources that they have, support and so forth from outside of Ukraine, but developing anti-missile capacities. To be able to shoot down ballistic missiles with degrees of reliability that, 2 years ago what would people have thought? So I don't know, Franky, maybe you can speak to this too. I think that we've seen definitely a repositioning towards greater learning now on the part of NATO member countries. Now the question is, does the learning get translated into the political decisions that then become the policy changes, and that filters down to the designers and the operators? I don't know. Is there learning, Franky?
Yeah, I mean, but the problem is that's always the battle of the bureaucracy is, how quickly are you willing to update all your programs of instruction, all your doctrine, all your manuals? I mean, again, there's a way the U.S. wants to fight, and there's a way adversaries want to fight, and if you don't change your doctrine and training fast enough, your adversary is going to, exploit like the asymmetry in the way we fight and exploit those weaknesses. And so again, if we're transmitting a certain way of fighting to the Ukrainians, and it has not been modernized and it has not been updated, and it's not, radically being innovated week in and week out, then we basically are falling behind like the power curve of how we train ourselves, but also how we train others.
Well, but one way to think about this is that the Russian military isn't necessarily known and celebrated for its capacity, its flexibility, and its capacity to innovate. Nor is I think the Russian bureaucratic system as a whole. Yet we see that pace of innovation, that I'd say surprising degree of flexibility, maybe on the part of Russians. So I think that these are solvable problems. Sort of the easy answer is maybe it's a problem of political will.
Well, yeah, but I mean, like, I guess, to Will Reno's point about, like, as this has basically been grinding into a defense in depth and defensive a stalemate of attrition, the only thing that's is going to break this is innovation in a tactic or strategy or technology. And a lot of the indicators, again, we're not trying to be prophets here, but a lot of the indicators and things we hear from people on the ground is the breakthrough will probably be whoever can master a drone swarm that uses AI cheaply and lightly and effectively in a way that it does essentially break the will of the enemy. So, if Ukraine and or Russia or some country could figure out a way to build 10,000 of these drones with a light, cheap AI tech on it that would allow you to swarm and overwhelm enemy positions, that would be the breakthrough that everyone is hoping for. We just have to hope that the breakthrough happens in favor of the Ukrainians and the Russians don't figure it out first.
That is indeed a question which everyone asks themselves, and we have seen already, like as you mentioned, several changes in the technology during this war. We have seen amazing developments on the battlefield with the tactics and with the bravery of the troops, but still we have the adaptation from the Russian side. We've seen that the Russian political system, first of all, has adapted and conducted several successful propaganda offensives in the West, effectively blocking like several Ukrainian partners in Europe and worldwide. And this is, of course, the development which we will still observe within the next months. Thank you so much for this interview. It was an amazing talk about all possible aspects of military training and of the development of the warfare in Russian-Ukrainian war. We have talked to Franky Matisek, PhD. He is Lieutenant Colonel of the US Air Force, military professor at the US Naval War College, and William Reno, who is a professor and chair of the department at the Northwestern University. They both have conducted a research in foreign military assistance for Ukraine, which they have conducted for the military department of the United States. Once again, the views demonstrated in this program are personal views of Jahara and William, not the views of the United States military department. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for this interview, for these insights, and have a great day.